Today we are not merely recounting a death, we are resurrecting a man's stolen dignity. We must shatter the comfortable illusions we've been fed and look upon Edgar Allan Poe not as a crazed entertainer performing for a cruel public, but as a profoundly unfortunate patient fighting a losing, agonizing battle against a slow, biological execution. This tragedy did not suddenly materialize on the chilly autumn night he drew his last breath. The true horror ignited with a violent, silent spark in the suffocating summer of 1849, when the foundational pillars of his brilliant mind began to show catastrophic, terrifying fissures. If you look closely at the letters Poe sent to his loved ones during those final months, the eloquent, razor-sharp intellect that defined him was gone, replaced by a suffocating, blood-chilling panic. He wrote obsessively of dark premonitions of a looming, inescapable doom breathing down his neck. The absolute apex of this psychological collapse occurred during what should have been a mundane train journey. Trapped in a moving metal box, Poe was suddenly seized by waking nightmares, utterly convinced that a shadowy syndicate of assassins was relentlessly hunting him down. The paranoia clung to his deteriorating mind like a parasite until he reached Philadelphia. In the dead of night, driven by a primal, blinding terror, he desperately pounded on the door of his old friend, John Sarton. When the door opened, the man standing there was entirely unrecognizable as the esteemed poet of the era. Poe stood trembling in the darkness, his eyes wide with a horrific blend of grandiose delusions and sheer, unadulterated dread. In a manic frenzy, he begged Sarton to immediately shave off his trademark mustache, desperate to disguise himself from the invisible demons swarming his reality. For generations, critics and gossips have pointed to that night as the tragicomic rambling of a hopeless alcoholic. But when viewed through the unforgiving, precise lens of modern medicine, this was no drunken stupor. These were the deafening alarm bells of a terminal catastrophe. They were the undeniable, agonizing clinical manifestations of a physical brain under siege, methodically being devoured from the inside out by a microscopic, unstoppable force. That microscopic, unstoppable force that first revealed itself in Philadelphia would soon swallow him whole during 5 missing days that remain one of history's darkest, most unsettling voids. On September 27, 1849, Edgar Allan Poe departed Richmond, Virginia, bound for Philadelphia to edit a collection of poems carrying with him a substantial sum of subscription money and the fragile hope of a new beginning. He never arrived. Instead, he vanished into an abyss, only to materialize nearly a week later on the rain-slicked cobblestone streets of Baltimore in a scene so deeply disturbing it defies logic. On October 3rd, a printer named Joseph W. Walker stumbled upon a delirious man slumped in the gutter outside Ryan's Tavern, a notorious polling place known as Gunner's Hall. The man was slipping in and out of consciousness, ravaged by a severe, agonizing physical distress that rendered him entirely unable to explain what had befallen him. But the true horror lay in his appearance. The Edgar Allan Poe known to society was a man of fastidious, almost obsessive neatness, a gentleman who wore impeccably tailored black woolen suits, even in the stifling heat of summer. Yet the shivering, broken creature Walker found in the dirt was dressed in the soiled, ill-fitting rags of a stranger. He wore a cheap, stained bombazine coat, torn pantaloons, a crumpled straw hat, and shoes that were practically falling off his feet. His prized walking stick, his luggage, and the money he had left Richmond with were completely gone. For over a century and a half, the lazy narrative has dictated that Poe simply drank away his belongings and fell into a stupor, or that he was the victim of cooping, a brutal political gang tactic where men were drugged, beaten, dressed in disguises, and forced to vote repeatedly. While the violence of cooping might explain the stolen clothes, It entirely fails to account for the catastrophic neurological meltdown radiating from his eyes. When we look past the sensationalism of the gutter, we see a helpless man whose brain was misfiring on a catastrophic level, stripped of his identity and abandoned to die in the freezing rain while his internal biology turned fiercely and violently against him. Transported from the filth of the tavern to the sterile, unforgiving walls of Washington Medical College, the final act of Poe's suffering began to unfold in excruciating, agonizing slow motion. Under the care of Dr. John J. Moran, Poe was locked inside a barren, windowless room cast into a lonely purgatory, where his mind oscillated violently between terrifying, combative delirium and a haunting, melancholic clarity. Dr. Moran's meticulous clinical observations from those final days provide the ultimate damning evidence against the drunkenness theory. The physician noted explicitly that Poe did not emit the slightest odor of liquor, nor did he exhibit the telltale distinct symptoms of alcohol withdrawal or delirium tremens. Instead, Poe was drowning in a profound physiological crisis. He was drenched in unnatural freezing sweats, his limbs violently trembling as he was gripped by visual hallucinations that seemed to tear at the very fabric of his reality. Perhaps the most chilling detail of his confinement was his sheer visceral inability to consume water. When nurses attempted to offer him a glass to quench his feverish thirst, Poe violently rejected it, choking and gagging in a manner that points directly toward hydrophobia, a hallmark terrifying symptom of advanced neurological decay. As the nights dragged on, the esteemed author was reduced to a primal state of terror. In the dead, echoing silence of the hospital ward, Poe began to repeatedly, desperately scream out a single name: Reynolds. To this day, no historian, no biographer, and no scholar has ever been able to definitively identify who Reynolds was. Was it a hallucinated demon from his shattered psyche, a forgotten figure from his missing days in Baltimore? Or was it the name of a shadowy phantom his dying brain had conjured to guide him into the abyss? He shouted for this entity until his voice broke and his throat bled. A profoundly heartbreaking image of a towering literary giant reduced to a terrified child, crying out in the dark, entirely consumed by a disease no one in that era had the capacity to understand. The tragic cries that echoed through those hospital halls were not the ravings of a drunkard, yet the moment his exhausted heart finally stopped beating on October 7th, the vultures immediately descended to feast upon his reputation. The architect of this monstrous, enduring lie was a vindictive literary rival named Rufus Griswold. Writing under a pseudonym, Griswold penned a venomous obituary and later a comprehensive falsified biography that painted Poe as a depraved, drug-addicted madman who walked the streets in a state of perpetual intoxication. Griswold forged letters, manipulated facts, and capitalized on the dark nature of Poe's own fiction to convince the world that the author was indistinguishable from the sociopaths and lunatics he wrote about. The public, hungry for scandalous tragedy, swallowed the deception whole. However, modern forensic pathology and neurological science tell a completely different, profoundly more tragic story. When we apply contemporary medical knowledge to Poe's documented symptoms, the paranoia in Philadelphia, the missing days, the ill-fitting clothes, the horrific hallucinations, the fluctuating pulse, and the hydrophobic rejection of water, the puzzle pieces align with terrifying precision. Many medical experts now passionately argue that Poe was the victim of late-stage rabies contracted from a stray animal bite long before his death, a virus that lay dormant before slowly and methodically liquefying his brain. Others point to heavy metal poisoning, or perhaps even more compellingly, a lethal brain tumor tumor. In fact, when Poe's remains were exhumed and moved to a new resting place nearly 3 decades after his death, a worker noted a strange hardened mass rolling around inside his skull. The brain itself rots away quickly after death, but a calcified tumor survives, perfectly matching the progressive personality changes, the blinding headaches, and the ultimate neurological collapse he suffered. Any of these clinical realities absolutely obliterate the pathetic narrative of the gutter drunk, revealing instead a man fighting a terminal biological war he was destined to lose, misdiagnosed by a primitive medical era and maliciously slandered by a jealous rival. Armed with the clinical truths of his final agony, we are profoundly compelled to look back at the monstrous caricature created by his enemies and tear it to the ground. Edgar Allan Poe spent his entire creative life writing about the sheer suffocating terror of being buried alive, of being trapped in the dark, while the world above goes on entirely ignorant of your silent screams. It is the most cruel, devastating irony of literary history that this exact fate befell him not in a physical coffin, but in the annals of history. His true humanity, his brilliant, sensitive soul, and his desperate fight against a ravaging disease were buried alive beneath a century and a half of fabricated slander and lazy gossip. We owe it to him to shatter the glass of that metaphorical coffin. When we envision Poe now, we must violently reject the image of the drunken, degenerate fiend stumbling through the streets of Baltimore. We must instead see a profoundly resilient, deeply tormented genius whose body betrayed him in the most agonizing way imaginable. We must recognize the heartbreaking tragedy of a man whose brilliant mind, the same mind that pioneered the modern detective story, that mapped the darkest corners of human psychology and that penned verses of unparalleled haunting beauty, was slowly eaten away by a silent, invisible executioner. Reclaiming his legacy is not just a matter of historical correction, it is a profound act of empathy, a long overdue restoration of dignity to a man who suffered unimaginably in his final hours. The shadows he created in his literature will forever captivate our imaginations, but it is finally time we pull the man himself out of the darkness, honoring the tragic medical truth of his demise and allowing Edgar Allan Poe to rest, at last, in the peace he was so brutally denied in life. For over a century, the tragic demise of Edgar Allan Poe was overshadowed by a malicious narrative that reduced a towering literary genius to a pathetic, drunken caricature. As the evidence reveals the haunting details of his final days, from his sudden disappearance and the ill-fitting rags found on him in that Baltimore gutter to his hydrophobic delirium and agonizing echoing cries for the mysterious Reynolds point, not to an alcohol-induced stupor but to a catastrophic medical crisis. Whether it was the devastating ravages of late-stage rabies or the blinding pressure of a calcified brain tumor discovered decades later inside his exhumed skull, Poe was clearly a man losing a terrifying biological war. The cruelest twist of fate was that his legacy was subsequently hijacked by a jealous rival, Rufus Griswold, who buried Poe's true humanity beneath a mountain of forged letters and sensationalized slander. Modern medical insights finally allow us to shatter this historical coffin. Poe was not a degenerate fiend. He was a resilient, brilliant pioneer of the macabre, whose own body betrayed him in ways that mirrored the suffocating horrors of his own fiction. By replacing the lazy gossip of the past with clinical truth, we resurrect his dignity. We finally pull Edgar Allan Poe from the shadows of character assassination, honoring the tragic reality of his suffering and cementing his rightful place, not as a madman, but as one of history's greatest, most profoundly misunderstood minds. millions. The unsettling story of Poe's tarnished legacy serves as a stark, timeless warning about the destructive power of misinformation and the ease with which a reputation can be assassinated. Griswold's malicious lies thrived because the public eagerly consumed scandalous gossip without questioning its source. In our modern digital age, where rumors, out-of-context narratives, and viral campaigns spread at the speed of light on social media, this lesson is more vital than ever. We must apply this to our daily lives by consciously refusing to participate in the blind consumption of sensationalism. Before rushing to judge someone's character or apparent downfall, we must seek the truth, demand context, and practice empathy. Behind every scandalous headline or digital rumor is a real human being fighting hidden battles. By cultivating a critical, compassionate mindset, we can prevent others from suffering the metaphorical premature burial that Poe endured for over a century. We would love to hear from you. After learning about the hidden medical evidence, do you think Edgar Allan Poe was the victim of a brain tumor, rabies, or perhaps something else entirely? Please share your thoughts politely in the comments below so we can explore these theories together. If you found this historical deep dive fascinating, please hit the subscribe button to support the channel. It gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more captivating and untold stories from history. For 150 years, history lied to you. Edgar Allan Poe didn't die a drunken madman in a gutter, found shivering in a stranger's rags, his brain liquefying. He died screaming a phantom's name. The terrifying medical truth behind his final days is darker than his most twisted fiction. Imagine dying in absolute agony, your mind fracturing into 1,000 terrifying shards, only for the world to look upon your corpse and sneer, writing you off as a worthless, drunken lunatic. For nearly 2 centuries, humanity has eagerly consumed a grotesque lie, freezing one of our greatest literary geniuses into a single pathetic portrait of a drug-addicted madman who supposedly drank himself to death in a filthy gutter. We have allowed his legacy to be mutated into a monstrous caricature ripped straight from the very pages of his own Gothic nightmares. But the truth history conceals is infinitely more merciless, more tragic, and far more terrifying than any fiction he ever dared to pen. Before we peel back the layers of the most perfect and sinister character assassination in human history, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support is the vital heartbeat that empowers us to continue bringing these forgotten truths out of the darkness. Myth Eryndor welcome you. Welcome back to the shadows.